Let me start by praying. Father God, we thank you for this morning, all of your grace for us and bringing us together, and we pray for your blessing on this subject as we study it, that we would not be confused by the various doctrines of demons that have been not only in our culture, but that have been for many, many centuries, that people even revel in confusion and ignorance. Lord, protect us from that, and that we might heed the call to have mercy on those who doubt, and to have the kind of certainty in the knowledge that you give to us in your word, and the truth that you place in us and throughout your world. We pray for your blessing on this study in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'm calling this one Naming the Elephants in the Plural, because I'm going to contend that these three words you see here, agnosticism, skepticism, and relativism, are really doing the same thing, but they're shifting. They're doing it in a different way, different packaging. And now where do I get this title or this concept from? Well, I don't know if you've ever heard this. I guess you could call it a parable. The person telling it, I think, thinks they are profound. It's not, but it goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, there were 6 blindfolded men. It almost doesn't matter the amount of men around the elephant, but they're blindfolded. And an elephant. And each person is reaching out and is saying, they're telling the other men what they think this thing is. One of them says, it's a rope. And another one says, well, no, it's definitely more like a tire or a leather bag maybe. Another one says, no, it's like a tree trunk. Another one says, no, it's like a snake. Another one says, no, this is definitely a spear. And so on. You get the idea. And by that point in the parable, it is obvious that the elephant represents God, or maybe ultimate truth, depending on who's telling it, what their purposes are. There's just one problem with the parable, because the person telling it is obviously trying to get the point across that, you see, each world religion, or each person, or each culture, again, depending on who it is telling it, has a little bit of the truth, but none of us has the whole. Well, here's the trouble. How did you come to find out about the elephant? How did you come to find out while we're at it about the 6 blindfold men, that they were blindfolded, that there were 6 of them? How did we find out about that? Well, it's because it took a 7th observer who was not blindfolded, who could see that it was an elephant and that everybody else besides himself was blindfolded. Now he's coming to you with this story. That's the basic problem with it. So every form that this takes involves the same kind of cheating, because that's what it is. And it's going to reveal this supposedly profound and supposedly humble, by the way, because that's involved here too. Supposedly humble unknowing requires them to take this double standard. And one of the things we're going to see about that is that not only is that self-defeating, it's also self-deifying. Because the person who does it isn't just contradicting himself, and we'll show that more clearly, but he's denying to everyone else that knowledge which he reserves for himself. He alone can see the whole. He alone can see this thing and call it an elephant. He alone sees all perspectives. But none of these other people can. Very interesting. Now, it takes, as I said, 3 main forms. Agnosticism, so that's where we'll spend maybe the bulk of our time. Skepticism and relativism. No, it'll actually be pretty even here, but I think this will give you the idea as far as the logical problem, and then we'll just sort of apply it to other forms that it takes. So let's start with agnosticism. Now, here I'm just giving you the standard, normal, popular way that these things come to you, but we're going to have to do some translation here. Now, as far as the word agnostic, it seems to have emerged with T.H. Huxley in the middle of the 19th century. But really, the philosophy behind it goes back a century earlier with Hume and Kant and their criticisms against not only natural theology and the idea of knowing supernature and knowing metaphysical things, things you can't see, but also, by the end of it, the idea of knowing the essence of things, the one way that the world is. By the time that was over, you couldn't know anything if you were consistent. And that's part of the problem, is that nobody's really ever consistent with it. But the word itself, agnostic, let's think about that for a second. In the Greek, that's denying something. And then gnosis, Gnosis, that would be no knowledge. So if you want to really rattle their cage and they announce that they're an agnostic, what they want to communicate to you and get you to agree to is that they're not committed. I don't have a religion. I'm not claiming anything. I'm just saying I'm above it all. Maybe they won't say it like that. But what you really should say to them is, okay, well, you have nothing to offer me then. No knowledge. I mean, I say if a college professor tells you that, you should take him seriously and drop the class. Why spend your money on it if he has nothing to offer you? But that's not what they mean. They mean something else. Now, agnosticism takes two basic forms. Sometimes we speak of a soft agnosticism and a hard agnosticism. So soft agnosticism would be, I don't know. Hard agnosticism would be, you can't know. Who can't know? No one. And it's not just if I can't know, no, but it's more of a philosophical stance. This is the sort of thing that we can't know. And that's really what it comes to mean. Most people that use this, nobody goes around calling themselves an agnostic, and all they mean by it is, well, I don't know about that. Maybe you know, but I don't. Some people will. We'll get to a relativistic stance. But in this form, they're saying this thing is unknowable. And however many different flavors it might take, and this is the reason I'm going with these five. These are the five that I tend to see all the time. There's a basic unifying logic to any form of agnosticism. So what we're going to see is that this essential form, and all five of these I'm saying are going to take the same form. That's why I'm going to do some translation here to show that. Any form it comes in violates that most basic law of logic that we talked about, the law of non-contradiction. So just recall that expansion of the brackets from terms, square circle, to propositions, this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. Well, now the situation is going to be a proposition too, not too long, but it doesn't seem to contradict itself in that obvious surface way that the chalk did. And the reason, there's a couple reasons. One is that you're using synonyms and you're concealing it behind those synonymous terms rather than using the same term in the subject and the predicate, because that would be an obvious contradiction. Nobody ever wants to do that. But these are the five. The supernatural cannot be known, or supernature cannot be known, something like that. And sometimes that'll come up in the debate about intelligent design, other times for some other reason. The finite cannot grasp or contain the infinite, and it'll be said in different ways. You ever hear that? God is too big of a concept. You heard that? God is too big of a concept. We can't possibly get our minds wrapped around him. Well, of course we can't get our minds wrapped around him. We talk about the incomprehensibility of God. Truth is relative. Sometimes truth is subjective. Same thing, same meaning. And then we saw this one already. Reality is an illusion. So it'll come in one of those. Now, what if we were to convert this to make it a little bit easier? And I'm going to convert it twice because I'm going to argue there's two things that are concealing the contradiction here. Now, if you were to take logic and you were to put these in categorical statement form, you actually have to put it like this. There has to be a being verb. Don't ask me why. Your subject and predicate terms both have to be nouns, which I didn't do 2 weeks ago when I introduced it. Doing pop-level stuff. But you also have what's called a quantifier, which is either going to be all, some, or none. And what all of those do is it kind of shaves off the rough edges, those places of ambiguity that can allow somebody to sneak something by, to equivocate on their terms, mean something different by it, and shift things around. Maybe unwittingly, maybe they're not trying to be malicious or anything like that, and it just gets really specific and really hones in on what we're talking about here. So you'd have to say, and sometimes that leads to the predicate sounding a little funny, because you're taking adjectives, adverbs, and sometimes action verbs, and you're putting all of that, stuffing it all into this object, and so you have to come up with these, sometimes make up some words, but it has to be accurate to explain what we're talking about. And of course, when you're talking to somebody who disagrees with you, you want to check with them and say, okay, is this what you're saying? And part of it is you don't want to misrepresent your opponent either. Okay? So that's what we're doing here with this translation. All supernature is an unknowable nature. Now we're starting to see maybe a little bit of that chalk and no chalk come into this. All infinity is a finite, uncontainable thing. Okay, that's a little confusing. Well, maybe we'll come back to that. All God is, now you might say, all God, why? Well, that's awkward. But what you're saying there is you're saying, if I see God, if we're talking about God at all, anything about God, see, that's really what that all and the noun is meant to do, is an inconceivably big thing. That's what they're going to mean by too big. All truth is a relative perspective. That's what they mean by relative or subjective. All reality is an illusion. That one's really already kind of set up for us here. Okay, now we've already seen, by the way, what's wrong with that, with the absolute illusion. It takes a backdrop, something that you know, something called reality, in order to say that this thing in some way doesn't match up, whether it's because I'm having a dream or because my senses are deceiving me, etc. You're assuming something about reality, but we've already seen that. But notice what all five of these statements have in common on the most simple level. Let's get even more simple than that whole backdrop argument from last time. Notice that all of these are denying our ability to know the object in question. It's denying that we can know this thing called supernature, that we can know this thing called infinity, that we can know God, that we can know truth or know reality. What's less obvious, and I think it's because it's so basic to our language, it's easy, is that all of them contain this subject and predicate. So we're going to have to kind of go back to 101 level and force the person we're talking to look at the most basic rudimentary pieces here. Every predicate is saying something about its subject. So let's just go third grade here and force our opponent to come back to third grade with us. Every predicate is ascribing or attributing something, not everything, but at least one thing to the subject. Is everybody following that so far? No hocus pocus going on at all. That's what you'll be accused of when you use logic. It's too easy. There must be a word trick going on. But every predicate is saying one thing at least about its subject. Okay? I was going to go into another reason why this is why we do this translation. I mean, even when you use words like can and cannot, or especially when you have an action verb, you've got to eliminate all of that because really what you're after is, I brought up that thing called a quantifier. It's got to be all, some, or none. In the middle, you have a qualifier, and that has to either say is or is not. And all that does is it just eliminates any kind of funny business, any kind of equivocation or ambiguity, and just makes it super clear, are you affirming this thing or are you denying this thing? And here, what they're doing is they're denying anything, any known thing about these five things. I'm beating this horse to death so that we can see this very, very clearly. So we have to ask, what's the agnostic position again? Isn't it precisely that we can know nothing about something? Supernature, infinity, God, truth, or reality. This is the something. And they're saying that you can know nothing about that, which is really just another way to say not one thing. That you can know not one thing about that subject. But what's the problem? You go to this. All of these, let's make it one notch simpler. Let's just forget for a second about the particulars of this predicate. These are all logically equivalent to saying that you can know not one thing and one thing about this thing at the same time and in the same relationship. Let me use layman's terms to say that. So, real conversation time with the person. God is too big of a concept, you say? What is this bigness you speak of? Is it something or nothing? Is it a known thing? You see the problem there. He's ascribing something to God or infinity. What kind of a thing is infinity that makes it the kind of thing that you can know not one thing about? And whatever his answer is, will be at least one thing. Now, I realize to a lot of people this is very torturous, boring, and almost, well, it's not almost, it's pedantic. And I think that's what is unattractive to a lot of people about logic. But then to other people, I think it just seems like kind of a word game. But what we're seeing here is that these statements are just as logically contradictory as this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. And this is what logic does, is you're translating and getting to the point where you're saying that this thing is either logically consistent or logically inconsistent. And what we're seeing here is that all five of these are logically inconsistent. And you can come up with more examples of the same thing, and the same problem will result. Because you are ascribing and denying some known essence to these things at the same time in the same relationship. And with that, agnosticism should be removed from the list of considerations for rational people. This is not a serious position because it can't get past that first round of logic. Whatever else somebody wants to stack on top of that, however much somebody wants to posture about this being the humble position or the scientific position or the modern position or whatever else, it's not a logically possible position. And therefore, it shouldn't be taken seriously on that basis. Now, of course, you have to show that. And that's what this is. Now, what do people do with this? Well, they come up with new versions. And we'll see this with skepticism and other things too. They repackage it. You're not looking. And then 20 years later, you look on Wikipedia or whatever. And you hear somebody say, well, I am an agnostic. Or I even heard 10 years ago, ignostic with I. See, and I'm like, what are you doing? You're just bored, or did you not get the memo? And it's a combination of both. But there was among smart philosophers a version of this in the mid-20th century called acognosticism. So you'd have the same thing and move the A over, and you would add CO, cognition is what they have in mind. There was a philosopher named A.J. Ayer in the middle of the 20th century. And what he did is he took a standard that had already been disproven among philosophers, not just by Christians, but by people in general that realized, that doesn't work, Mr. Hume, and it was Mr. Hume, David Hume, that came up with it. Here it is. It's at the end, the very last statement, actually, of one of his most influential books, The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And it's not a very big book. It's where he launches into his criticisms of knowing the exact cause of any effect. But at the very end of it, he starts to attack the old way of doing philosophy. That's what he means by school metaphysics, the scholastics in the Middle Ages. And he says this, and here's what he's doing. Let me set you up here, and it's why I separated these and put these in bold, because he's going to give you two options, and he's going to rule out both. What he's doing is he's giving us a standard for meaningful statements. He's saying, in order for a statement to be true about the world, it has to be either this or that. And statements about supernatural things don't cut it. That's what he's doing. Now let me read it. He says, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, in other words, take any of the books of the old thinkers, those Christians and those people doing natural theology. Let's ask this. Does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Let me explain what he means by that. It's an analytical statement, like we saw about cause and effect. What he's saying is, if we look at the sentences in those books, examine any statement at all, put it under the microscope, is it just sort of 2 + 2 = 4, or if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is also equal to C? Is it that kind of a thing, just deductive and analytical? No. On the other hand, does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? In other words, a hypothesis about like when water boils at a higher elevation or something, and then it tests itself and shows you its findings and so on. No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. In other words, what he's doing is the old way of doing philosophy, what the theologians gave us, is making positive statements about invisible things. But what's that even? That's what he's saying. And he wants to prove that by showing that it either has to be purely mathematical or deductive, logical, formal, or it has to be about stuff that I can do this with. What's the problem here? Any statement, in order to be a meaningful statement, has to be one of those two. I would ask Hume, do you want me to take your statement serious? This statement? Sure I do. It's the most meaningful statement you've ever heard of. Okay. Is this statement either purely analytical, formal, or purely empirical about your stuff? No. And in fact, no statement is. No statement is purely analytical, or those statements in geometry would be. But about real stuff. Now, it's assuming stuff about stuff, which we'll come back to. But the point here is that Hume's own criteria, his standard, fails itself. It's self-defeating. And so, according to Hume's own standard, his book should be cast into the flames as sophistry and illusion. Now, philosophers for 200 years got that. The problem is we unlearn things. And in the 20th century, during the high point of different philosophies like positivism and a newer philosophy in the 20th century, linguistic, analytical, the beginnings of analytical philosophy, but people were just analyzing language, and they had long since started to say, well, philosophy, that's just a bunch of guys in togas before science came along. But maybe after Kant, philosophy can have another noble service. It could be critical. In other words, it could just be analyzing our terms and so on. So that's kind of what philosophy became to these kind of people. And it became very fashionable among this crowd to start saying, well, statements about God are not even false. In other words, they don't rise to the level of matter of fact. And so now you can see where this agnosticism is coming from. Ayer, and he wrote a book called Truth, Language, and Logic, in which he tried to revive this principle by the name the verification principle. And that if something couldn't be verified, in other words, shoved into a test tube, then it wasn't talking about real stuff. Two problems. One is it begs the question. He's assuming up front that material realities are the only realities. Well, that's question begging. That's the whole debate. You can't assume it up front. Secondly, he is assuming that empirical investigation is the only means of attaining truth. And again, that begs the question. That's the whole debate here. You can't assume it up front. That's the first problem. The second problem, though, in addition to the question-begging fallacy, is he's just regurgitating this same failed principle in different language, and either hoping that nobody notices it, or is himself self-deceived and doesn't realize he's just reviving Hume's failed criticism. But that was the idea of agnosticism. It's not just that we can't have any knowledge. We can't even understand the concept. When you say God, you're not even talking about anything substantive that I could even say it's false. That's kind of the idea there. It's a good way to avoid having a conversation, by the way, is to say, your lips are moving, but I don't hear anything coming out. Well, that's not an argument. Okay? So, once you show agnosticism is logically self-contradictory in all of its forms, that's good, but that doesn't prove God or that you can know things about God and things. That's true. But you do have to do demolition work before you get to build on a new ground. So that's agnosticism. We've eliminated it in round one. Skepticism. I won't bore you with the whole history of it, except to put these three pictures up. But so in the ancient world, and this is what happens when civilization goes into decline. In the Greek world, after Plato and Aristotle, so the glory years of philosophy, after the golden age of Greece, because when Athens started to fall, that's when philosophers really started to think, and that's when you had Plato and Aristotle. But then one of Aristotle's, his famous pupil, Alexander the Great, took Greek knowledge throughout the known world. And one of the problems with taking stuff throughout the known world is it starts to spread you too thin. The Romans would learn this too eventually, like we're learning it now. Not really. You don't learn it when it's happening. You just do it stupidly and somebody else has to learn it for you later on. But the Greeks were doing that. And as they were doing that and spreading themselves too thin, philosophy, as Greece was being replaced as a world power by Rome, Greek philosophy started to turn more inward and more cynical and then eventually skeptical. So there were basically four Greek schools of philosophy after Plato and Aristotle before you get to the time of Jesus. There's the Epicureans and the Stoics, but then there's these more, and they're called cynicism and skepticism. This guy's name is Pyrrho. Maybe it's Pyrrho, but I like to say Pyrrho because it reminds you of a pyromaniac, because that's kind of what you think of when you think of skepticism. It's sort of a scorched earth policy where you doubt absolutely everything you can possibly doubt, and that becomes, hey, look at me, I'm a free thinker. I'm so brave and humble that I can't believe anything. Even what you're saying right now? So that's what you got to call him on. So this guy Pyrrho comes up with all these things at about that time, and he embraced sort of an Eastern mysticism. He concluded that the nature of reality is indeterminable. And the problem with reality not being able to be determined is that it also has an ethical implication, is that you shouldn't impose your views on other people. Now, eventually this view got replaced. You had a revival of Platonism, even before Jesus came, but it was influential on some early Christian thinkers. So about 200 AD, this guy comes around, Sextus Empiricus, and he's sort of famous for reviving these views in the academy. And there were different kinds of skeptics. Some skeptics really were scorched earth, I doubt everything. Some of them were just using it as a tool to make sure we get closer at truth and we don't allow anything in that doesn't meet the grade. Well, the side that eventually won was the more skeptical skepticism. And one of the reasons this is important in Christian history is that this guy gets revived about the time of the Reformation. Because of the Reformation, you had Roman Catholics and Reformed people. One of the arguments, and it wasn't their leading argument, but one of their arguments to cast doubt on the other was to use these skeptical writings to say, oh, you hold to Scripture as your highest authority? And Reformers say, oh, you hold to the church as your highest authority? And so it would be a way of undermining the other's ultimate authority, is to say, well, your view is subject to this skepticism. So you had, especially in France, and guys like Montaigne and others that were skeptical, and that's where Descartes comes in when he publishes his Discourse on Method in 1637, at least that's one of the main kind of going theories about what motivated him. Some people would say, well, he was just pretending to be Roman Catholic. He really was just a skeptic and an atheist and all that. I don't think you could show that, but at the very least, you can say that what motivated him was that Roman Catholics said, this is my authority. Protestants said, this is my authority, and the man on the street is becoming confused and saying, well, how do I know? How do I become certain? And so what he did is he employed skepticism as a tool, as a method. He basically says, I'm going to doubt everything I can possibly doubt, and including, if I can, mathematical formulas and things like that. I could go wrong about math. And that's where he came up with what we talked about 2 times ago, I think, therefore I am. But that just shows you that skepticism can either be kind of like agnosticism. We said there could be a soft and a hard brand. Skepticism could either be universal or limited, targeted. Okay, and that's what it tended to be for Descartes, is targeted. Now, aside from the history, because that can get boring, what about its claims? What about the coherence of the doctrine itself? Well, if you go all the way into that radical skepticism, that Pyrrhonianism sometimes it's called, is that it invalidates itself for the same reason as agnosticism. Again, it's not to be trite or anything like that, or a noisy gong, but when somebody does say that, whether it's your college professor or anything else, well, we can't be certain about anything. Are you certain? Well, it's just that we can't know necessary truth. Oh yeah, necessarily. Well, you can't know absolutes. Absolutely. And you could just do that game, and it's not a word game. You're holding that person accountable for nonsense. He's telling you, we can't know. And I think when people do that, you should take them seriously and say, I agree, you don't know. That's why I'm here. I'm going to help you out. Okay? So that's the kind of things we could say. It is self-contradictory to say that, because that statement is claiming something about everyone. It's claiming to see the whole elephant. Craig and Moreland, in their book on philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview, break skepticism down into 3 categories. And they call these iterative skepticism, meta-epistemological skepticism, and heuristic or methodological skepticism. Now, all that means, and that's why I bring in the pictures, is the kind of person that comes up to you, and for them it is just a verbal game. They're casting doubt on you. They're employed in, I would say, spiritual warfare. Whether they know it or not, I would put it that way or not, they are simply trying to confuse you. Or they really believe it themselves and are so deluded themselves that they want to share the joy of their complete and utter darkness with you. I know some people like that. And that's what's going on here, is that the questions are just hitting you, and that's all it is to it. It's indiscriminate. This idea is more worked out as a view, but it too is limited, even though it looks universal here. This is really meant to depict, it's the world, but it just means the whole universe. So the physical universe, the world, sometimes they're used as synonyms. This person is saying, I can't see it, smell it, taste it, touch it. You see the idea here? Therefore, you can't know it. If it exists at all, we can't know it. What are they saying? You can't sense it. What are they saying? Sense equals no. No equals sense. Like we're dogs or plants. I mean that. And we'll talk about that when we get to the proof from mind in a couple of weeks. But that is what they're saying. If it's supernature, it's unknowable. Oh, where did I hear that before? Agnosticism. So that's what I mean by it's the same form. It's putting on a different dress and hoping you don't notice. And again, maybe the person doesn't notice it themselves. Then you have this one. This is a method. So now what is the question marks are outside of this method. I am protecting a certain way of knowing things, whether it be in science or anything else. But typically for these people, it will be science. That if it's outside of the scientific method and repeated testability, in other words, if it's not falsifiable. Now, even though that's going to take the same form and suffer the same problems we've seen, there's going to be additional problems, logical problems for that idea, and we'll see that when we do our week on science. And to give you a hint, The problem there is that it involves them they're forcing themselves into the corner of saying that the falsifiability principle is, in principle, unfalsifiable, which is going to be a violation of the law of non-contradiction. They're saying science is the highest court of appeals, really the only one worth talking about, because material things are the only things that exist. Okay, so then every meaningful statement then has to be falsifiable. Okay, so we'll get there when we do our week on science. But again, it's going to be the same violation of the law of non-contradiction in that one. Now, this is going to suffer an obvious defeat, as agnosticism did. This view, if really all you're saying is that within science it has to be falsifiable, and I'm not going to speak to things outside of science. Well, okay, that's a more modest view. That's not really saying anything against the Christian view. So it's more this one that we're going to have to do business with. This one will be a little bit easier to show why it's nonsense. This we have to do a little bit more work. So we'll do some of that in several of the weeks to come. Okay? Craig and Moreland go on to point out that a more comprehensive skepticism, one of these two, may direct their skepticism either at the generation, transmission, or sources of belief. We'll start to see that next week with atheism, but I won't get there yet. The kind of arguments made against theism change in the 19th century and become less powerful arguments, although they caught on because people are not as smart. And so we'll see that. This view is wrong not because it doesn't match up to the world. This view is wrong because the way that you came to that view is illegitimate in some way. So we'll see that. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. Here's another way to see the problem with skepticism and maybe the self-contradictory nature of it. In a book called Skepticism and Animal Faith, George Santayana, he's an English-speaking philosopher. He's the one that said, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, in this book, he says this: skepticism is a suspicion of error about facts. And to suspect error about facts is to share in the enterprise of knowledge, in which facts are presupposed and error is possible. Skepticism is accordingly a form of belief. Dogma cannot be abandoned. It can only be revised in view of some more elementary dogma which it has not yet occurred to the skeptic to doubt. So that's, if you mistrust when people, if you think Christians are playing word games by saying, when you say, well, you can't be certain, and I shoot back to you, are you certain about that? If you think things like that are just a word game or sort of a clanging cymbal or something like that, what Santayana is saying here, he's drawing why that actually is not just a word game. He is drawing out the fact that when you ask your question, and it's a leading question, you can't ask a leading question with your feet in midair. You have some ground, you have some basis on which to say, I doubt that. Why do you doubt that? For some reason or no reason. If you have no reason to doubt it, why should I take your question mark seriously? If you have some reason to doubt it, then you have some reason, which is to say that you believe something is true. Okay? And then you start, wherever that point of departure is, you start to build back on that ground. Now let's see it in one more packaging. The elephant's getting dressed back up. And here I have Columbus savaging the natives, or Columbus, and that was the title on these. And that's why I'm using that word. You have this historical thing that generates all this animosity. And there's a lot at stake, and a lot of hard feelings over interpretations of things like colonialism in general. And it raises all sorts of questions that, whether people know it or not, or like it or not, are filled with moral pronouncements. That, well, you don't have the right to such and such. And that was wrong, and so on. And no matter how you frame the question, you are making moral pronouncements. So relativism, as the name suggests, is the viewpoint that all views are relative. to their point of view. That means that the truth is meaningful and real only in some limited sense or to some limited degree. And if you state the doctrine that way, it sort of tips you off to the contradiction at the outset. But let's just dissect it anyway, because I already cheated and told you I'm claiming it's the same elephant. Let me say it this way. Let's move away from the elephant and toward a commercial that I remember. As my kids were young, we were watching the Disney Channel. And I will never forget this because I made a big deal out of it to my kids at that moment. I was not about to let this slide by. There was a commercial. It was like 20 years ago. There's a commercial, and you have a bowl of spaghetti and a procession of kids, maybe 3, 4, or 5, I don't remember, who were blindfolded. Does it already remind you of something? And they were sticking their hands in the bowl, and they were giggling and saying, "It's worms." And another kid, and I don't remember what the other kid said, to be very honest with you. "It's Jell-O, I don't know." But the whole time that they were saying these things and getting it wrong, there was a graphic on the screen that pointed to the thing that said, "It's spaghetti," to the viewer. So natural as a parent, I thought to myself, okay, they're not trying to indoctrinate my kids. Whew. Not so fast, because as the commercial ended, in spite of putting that graphic up there, in spite of the fact that we have all eyes, and they're not trying to insult our intelligence, are they? The tagline with the graphic on the screen and all the kids joining in unison is, "It's all in how you look at it." And I turned to my kids and I said, "Wait a minute, is that true? Is it true?" And they're all like, toddlers are just trying to watch, Bear in the Big Blue House or whatever it was. And I said, "Is it or not? Well, what's in the bowl?" "Spaghetti?" "Yes." "Was it at any point ever non-spaghetti?" "No." "So it's spaghetti." "Right." "So it wasn't worms?" "Yeah." "Good. So is it all in how you look at it?" "No." "Good. Don't make that mistake, ever." And I'll never forget that. Never pass up an opportunity to teach better philosophy than they're trying to push over on your kids. But anyway, so it's not just the elephant. There's a lot of different forms that this comes in. Relativism can take different, it can come up over the question of truth. More often than not, it comes up under the idea of morality. And by the way, don't think for a second that when a Christian says something like, "Well, that was in the Old Testament," or "That's just law and we're under grace," and all that stuff, they're slipping into moral relativism. Just came to it by a different route. Or it can sort of combine these two. I would always say that when it's relativism, well, you've got your truth, I've got mine. That's epistemological relativism, or it's all in how you look at it. Or if somebody says, nowadays they say, "Well, you do you." Well, that works for you, and this works for me. That's moral relativism. And by the way, sometimes this can take on different forms about time and about scope. So here's what I mean by that. Time. I guess both of these can do that. Somebody can say, "Well, that was true. That was all right back then. But now..." Hold on, stop. If what you're going to say at the end of your sentence is, "We now know," if that's even true, I'll spot you that for a second. Well, then it was never true back then. It was either false then and is false now, or it was true then and it's true now. Its truth value doesn't change over time. And then sometimes it can happen as a matter of scope. In other words, a general truth can be seen to be refuted by exceptions. And you see all sorts of things like that. For example, this is sparked again, male versus female competitiveness and physicality based on the Olympic stuff. Forget about the transgenderism thing for a second, just things that you've always had, whether it's sort of the battle of the sexes like in tennis in the 80s, or something more serious like recruits to VMI and what should be the military state, or the fire department. How many push-ups should be done, and so on and so forth. And for someone to say, no, I know someone that can do X amount of push-ups or lug this up a ladder and so on and so forth. It's not the burden of proof to say, to refute the counterexample. Okay? So general truths are not, or rules are not refuted by exceptions. The exceptions rather assume the rule. But that's sort of maybe a side or a little bit tougher way to see relativism coming out. Anyway, cultural relativism is really sort of a combination of both writ large on different cultures. And that becomes very, very, very difficult. Because the person that, and you saw this in the turn of the 20th century, really for 100 years, in anthropology departments, and it's why anthropology departments never really, they're there still, but it's not a really hot commodity, because there was a big debate right from the beginning about whether you can judge ancient cultures. Say, well, no, we're not judging. Our job is to describe. Our job is to understand. I found it very amusing. There was a Wikipedia article on cultural relativism. I got to read this, where they said, come on, where'd they say it? Oh, yes. No sense of irony, the Wikipedia article on the subject tells us that, quote, cultural relativism became popularized after World War II in reaction to historical events such as Nazism and to colonialism, ethnocentrism, and racism more generally. Well, that's a little odd. If that's what inspired you to go into cultural relativism because that was so evil, wouldn't that imply that your reaction should have been the opposite? After World War II, there were things that were so evil and made us so uncomfortable that we thought to embrace less of a handle on being able to judge them. Now, if you said it like that, I would have said, yes, that's stupid. But because you chose to say it that way, a lot of people aren't going to catch that. You just went in the opposite direction and totally robbed yourself of the tools, intellectual and moral, to be able to condemn them. By the way, this happens in science too. This is as good as anything else. There's certain, that circle is going to represent a lot of things. There are certain things in science under the general name relativity, and I don't just mean the general theory of relativity, but there are certain micro episodes in science that make people think that what they're seeing here is some kind of epistemological relativism. So, for example, light, how it's measured, but also what's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So there's this guy, Werner Heisenberg, who came up with this idea in the 1920s because it became increasingly clear. So if you see a car is a big object, I can see a car. I can measure the speed and the position of the car-ish. But if we're talking about something like a photon or an electron, there's an inverse relationship where I can, to the degree that I pin down the position, I can't observe the speed. And to the degree that I observe the speed, I can't pin down the position. Ooh, relativism. We don't know what's going on. No, wrong. Those are two distinct things. That's not A and non-A. That's A and B. All you're telling me there is that there's a dude over here, and he's got this angle, and there's a dude over here, and he's got that angle. Angle on what? It's still a photon. Anyway, better philosophers of the sort that were around 200, 300 years ago would have pointed that out. And Heisenberg wasn't trying to say that. It's only amateurs interpreting him that way. Schrodinger's cat. There's another one. You get yourself a cat in the box. I've tried this at home. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't try this, but I'm not a cat fan. But apparently the idea is that you have a flask and you have this acid or something that's tripped. So Schrodinger's having this conversation with Einstein in the 1930s, and it's an application of relativism. He's trying to test it out. And there's one situation in which, because of the problems with observation, the cat in there is simultaneously dead and not dead. But it's not in the same time in the same relation. It's a different relation because something about my observation is what tripped the the acid, or sorry, the radioactive thing to melt or break the glass, the flask, and the cat died in that case. Well, that's not a violation of the laws of logic. That's another A and B. Something about your observation caused that in both cases. The fact that you're not in the box to tell which one is which just means you're not God. Now, that's a difficult thing for 20th century man to figure out. So that's the problem. No, these are not examples of epistemological or absolute relativism. We better call those a local or restricted form of relativity, which we wouldn't doubt. Anytime there's a different angle on something, which is true about all finite observers, there's kind of relativity. Okay, I'm going to, last point. This kind of folly. Oh, yeah, that. Here's my point. Same thing's happening. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. All the things we talked about, this person is cheating. They got their scales. They want to say, oh, I can't tell one way or the other. It doesn't tip. Here's what they're saying in every single case. There's no one way to view this cheating. When you say that, you are claiming one way to view it. You're claiming it's an elephant. You're claiming it's a dead, non-dead cat. You're claiming it has a speed and a position, and it is a photon. You're redressing the elephant again and again and again, and it's the same dude. That's my point. Well, here's Alan Bloom. He wrote a book in 1987 called The Closing of the American Mind, and he starts out the book this way, and he's lamenting in his classrooms what has become this all-encompassing virtue. The only thing students know and care about when they come into my classrooms is openness. I have an open mind. No, don't try. If I try to have them justify their opinion, they look at me like I'm asking them to burn a witch. Here's what Bloom says. He says, the true believer is the real danger. The study of history and of culture teaches, he's talking about their view, not his own. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men always thought they were right, and that led to wars, persecutions, slavery, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all. You recognize this? That's the problem. People thought they were right about stuff. And that's why the brown shirts and red armbands just magically jumped on them and led to all the deaths. That's the way people think. Oh yeah, look at this guy. One last elephant for you. You ever see this picture? Again, the person presenting it feels very profound. And you have to burst his bubble. I asked my kids this last night. I showed my kids this picture. I said, what's this? Oh yeah, I showed Emily too. And they went with duck. They weren't even biting. I'm trying to do this with the computer screen, and anyway. But then look, it's a rabbit. Which is it? Oh, man. You know, there's a lot of things in reality that have multiple functions, not just multiple perspectives. It's the same elephant. Here's what's going on for real when people have this trouble. This is Aldous Huxley. He was the author of Brave New World. And he confesses what the problem is. He says, I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. Consequently, I assumed that it had none and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. You could take that piece of paper and turn it a million different ways. You could do that throughout the whole course of your life. You can pay expert people to take the elephant, re-blindfold you, put new clothes on them. You could do that for 60 years. It's super easy. But you haven't said anything profound, and you're doing it because you're in rebellion against God. Okay, I'll stop there. Questions, comments, or anything else? We got 5 minutes. I did a decent job of ending on time.
With Agnosticism, you start with exclusivity.
Yeah.
By saying all.
Yeah.
And if you change your verb and you make it instead of is, you change it to may be an unknown or might be
Yeah.
an unknowable thing. You also move into other categories in either case. If you say, well, most
Yeah.
supernature.
Right. And the moment you say that, then that leaves two problems for the real agnostic position. Because you could say, well, that's a soft agnosticism. But most people don't do that. Most people that claim to be agnostics are taking the hard line. That's why they're bringing it up. But if they do say that, well, most, then they're also saying, conversely, some then is knowable. Or at least you're leaving open the possibility that some is knowable. Okay, so, and you're not giving me a principle by which you can tell the difference between one class and the other. The part that's definitely not knowable and the part that is knowable. And until you have some principle, then I don't know where the line is. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, well, maybe all of it's knowable, as far as you've given me a criteria. Yeah. Anything else? Any buzzer beaters? Yep.
Just an observation, the appeal to science. The reality is that over time, science has changed multiple times. Things that were absolutely known 100 years ago are now false.
Yeah.
And when you confront them with that, the typical response would be, well, that's part of the scientific process, that we're always improving and refining.
There is an element of cheat there. They are saying, if they do say, it was absolutely known. Okay, is it absolutely known and falsifiable? Because you're committed to the idea of falsifiability. And at that point, they may soften it up and say, yes, but there's a scientific consensus. There's a paradigm. We should at least expect that for, 70 years it's going to be this, and you've got to give me a good reason to move outside that. Well, I agree. I got to give you a good reason. But now you're not saying the same thing, that there's this inviolable law that will always be, because there just isn't anything like that in science.